This is Jim Jones, and the way I got to know the Johnsons was basically through Lady Bird Johnson and Liz Carpenter and her staff. I was my last year of law school at Georgetown and working as a legislative assistant on Capitol Hill for a congressman from Oklahoma. And in the 1964 election, my best friend was Tommy Boggs, fellow classmate, and the Boggs family and the Johnson family were close. Well, he got me involved in advance work. And in the fall of '64, the decision was made that President Johnson would not be the most effective one to carry the campaign through the South because of signing and passage of the civil rights laws. And an idea was spawned to have an old-fashioned whistle-stop train tour through the South to start in Washington, end in New Orleans, and it would be headed by Lady Bird Johnson. So all of the seasoned advance people were working on the presidential campaign, and I was asked if I wanted to make advance one of the stops on this whistle-stop tour, the Lady Bird Special. Well, one thing led to another, one vacuum after another, and I ended up being in charge of the advance operations and putting the advance team together, et cetera, and then was on the train the whole time with Mrs. Johnson and Liz Carpenter and the rest of the staff. Well, apparently at the end of that, either Mrs. Johnson or Liz Carpenter told Jack Valenti, there's a young man that you ought to get on the staff. So after the campaign, Kenny O'Donnell, who was the appointments secretary holdover from President Kennedy, was leaving the staff, and Marvin Watson was being brought up from Texas to take this on, and they were looking for someone who had Washington experience. And lo and behold, I was invited to be Marvin Watson's assistant. So that's how I got to the White House. When I came there, both Jack Valenti and Marvin Watson said, now, you know, do the work, but don't be seen. Don't get around President Johnson, and eventually you will, but don't do it now. So anyway, I was 25 years old, and at that age, of course, you know everything. And in the setup of the White House, the West Wing, you had the Oval Office and the little private office, and then the next office was Marvin Watson's, the appointment secretary's office, and that job is roughly, I guess, what they'd call chief of staff today. In the Kennedy and Johnson White Houses, though, it was more like an administrative assistant to a U.S. senator. They just operated differently. And anyway, there was Marvin Watson's office next to the Oval Office, then Jack Valenti's office, and then down in the next office was one where I was and two other people. So one time, within the month after being there, I was in Marvin's office, and you could hear through the walls the president giving him a hard time, and all I could hear on Marvin's end of the telephone was, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. Well, I told Marvin and Valenti, I said, you know, the president doesn't want yes men. You know, stand up to him. Tell him what you think, this and that and the other thing. As I say, I was 25 and had all the answers. Well, within about a month, I was sitting in my office, and Marvin called me and said, would you come into my office? The president wants to talk to you. And I went in there, and it turned out that one of the things I did for Marvin was to pull together the schedule and to release that to the press. And one of the things that we did on a certain day each week was to have a congressional luncheon with the congressional leaders, a congressional breakfast. The president had decided to cancel the congressional breakfast that week. He was playing a cat and mouse chess game with Congress over a particular issue, and he canceled it. That word didn't get to me, so I gave it to, I guess it was George Reedy, who put it on the wire. The president read it right away, hit the ceiling, called Marvin, who put this out? And Marvin said, well, Jim Jones did, and so thus I'm called into Marvin's office, and Marvin has Jack Valenti there. And so in any event, I could hear the president through the thick walls of the Oval Office asking very pointed questions of me, and I'm on the line, and all Marvin and Jack Valenti could hear was, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. Well, the final one was, and when I was trying to explain what happened, and getting cut off, and the president said, "Well, it sounds to me like you were scratching your ass when you should have been scratching your head." I said, "Yes, sir." So that was my introduction, really, to the front and center Lyndon Johnson. From that, I really found a person who extended me beyond anything I thought I could do in terms of both energy level, imagination level, work accomplishment level. He really was able to push you and able to get the most out of you. The other thing that I saw was a multiple Lyndon Johnson, each of which was interesting in every way. I saw Robert Caro at an event, just happenstance, after he published the first volume of Lyndon Johnson, and I was as offended at that as anyone else who knew Lyndon Johnson, and I told him that he may have captured a Lyndon Johnson, but there were at least a dozen Lyndon Johnsons that he missed, and that were really Lyndon Johnsons that the public should know about. I know, Bob, when you and I and others would sit around and say, how do you capture the Lyndon Johnson that we know, that is now being discovered on these tapes that are being released? How do you capture that and put it on television? Because that would have given the public a much different view of Lyndon Johnson. He was a fascinating person in every respect, and someone that I came to totally respect and to love. The hill country was something very special to him. We would go down to the ranch even for a weekend, and it was like a 2-week vacation in the south of France for a lot of people. It just totally reinvigorated him. He reconnected with his roots. He relaxed and would go back on a Monday morning or a Sunday evening to Washington, and he was a revived person despite all the burdens of the office. It was interesting at the ranch because after about the first several months, I was the one, since I was the bachelor, and this was the respite for Marvin Watson and Jack Valenti to be with their families, I was the designated hitter to go to the ranch with the president along with his secretary Marie Famer. And that was a very interesting assignment because everything that came into the president came into the ranch and was handled by the two of us, and we saw the president in a much different light, saw Lady Bird in a much interesting, different light, and a very complimentary one because they really were at home there. I remember in 1967, when the Six-Day War was in the Middle East, Israel and Egypt, etc., the president had come down to the ranch, and in the middle of this, and Walt Rostow had to get some very important papers to him, and he was driving around one of the ranches, and I didn't know one from another, and so I call him on the squawk box and tell him I have a very important thing I need to get to him from Walt Rostow, and he said, well, bring it to me. So I get with the Secret Service, and we go off trying to find the president. And he's squawking at me the whole time on the squawk box. Where are you? Where are you? The whole damn war is going to be over by the time you find me. Well, we found him, and the war wasn't over, and the thing resolved itself. But he really enjoyed the ranch, and he really that gave him sustenance, so to speak. It was a confining experience there. I remember one summer, he had the swimming pool that he could walk from his bedroom right outside to the swimming pool, but it got very hot, and sometimes in the winter it got too cold. And he had heard that Abe Fortas, the Supreme Court Justice and a longtime friend of his, had a big bubble, a plastic bubble over his pool in Washington. So he wanted one exactly like that. And so he got a bubble, and it was all in place. And then one time we were there, and it gets very humid inside this bubble. And so he was there, and he says, call Abe and find out how do you get rid of all this humidity in this bubble, and what do we do about this? And so I called Justice Fortas, told him the problem, and he said, the best thing you can do is to grow tropical plants. And so that was the answer, which if you had to give a smart-ass answer to President Johnson. I always liked the way his lips kind of curled up, the way it really was funny, because you knew he appreciated it, but he wasn't quite sure that was the answer he wanted. Another time he had peacocks. Someone had given him a couple of peacocks, and those peacocks propagated rather quickly and rather broadly, and they would gather outside of his window of his bedroom and make the loudest noises. So he said, "Get rid of the peacocks." Well, I didn't realize it at the time. This was early on in going to the ranch. But this became a rather major military action. I asked the military aide how we're going to get rid of these, and the peacocks, first of all, went down toward the Pedernales River, and the grass was a little taller and they were hard to get at there. The next thing I know, this order to get rid of the peacocks without killing them had military helicopters hovering overhead while they tried to blow the grass down, and had the military people catching these peacocks. And President Johnson thought that was a good way to handle this particular situation. Lyndon Johnson was always trying to solve problems. He was always trying to get people together. Just across the Pedernales, as you drive out of the ranch, at each end was a Catholic church and a Lutheran church. And as you know, historically, the Catholics and the Lutherans have not gotten along, and it was President Johnson's desire to get them to do something for the common good of that particular part of Texas. And so he had a poverty program, and he insisted that the two of them co-sponsor the poverty program, and that would be the way it goes. And he had more fun getting them together on this poverty program. On Sundays, we would go to churches. We'd go to the Catholic church, and then we'd go down to the Lutheran church for its service, and carrying all the guests with us to Sunday services. Father Wunibald Schneider was the priest at the Catholic church, and I'm Catholic, and Father Schneider came from Germany. He wore the garb of an old-fashioned priest with a big, broad-brimmed black hat and of course the Roman collar, and he spoke with a German accent still. And then I guess it was some period in there, Konrad Adenauer died, the Chancellor of Germany, West Germany, and we were going to the funeral, and the night before, or the day before, President Johnson said for me to call Father Schneider and see if he would like to go to the funeral. And he did indeed, so a plane was dispatched to bring him back to Washington, and Father Schneider joins the presidential delegation to the funeral for Konrad Adenauer. And President Johnson really enjoyed doing things like this. We come out of the service, the funeral service, and there is de Gaulle and President Johnson and Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister of Italy, and all of the major leaders of the world in a line coming out there. And at the end, there's Father Wunibald Schneider. And I understand that it drove Harold Wilson and the British delegation that is so caught up on protocol, who this Father Wunibald Schneider was and his role of power in the United States government. So, and President Johnson got a great kick out of that. So those were some of the things that endeared President Johnson to me, is the fact that he really, his roots were always in Texas, and his strength came from that hill country. And his strength came from his experiences when he, so many times, both in Texas and in Washington, talked about his experiences as a teacher in the Mexican-American school in Cotulla, Texas. A lot of people didn't know he spoke Spanish, not well, but he spoke enough to speak to the Mexican-Americans who were there in the hill country that he would come across while he was driving around the ranch or driving around Johnson City or the hill country. He would see them and stop and talk to them in some broken Spanish, but could communicate very well. But those experiences of seeing people who really didn't have an opportunity, was what really motivated him in his public service career, and it was not, as I told Mr. Caro, it was not a question of an ego sense of power. It really was a question to solve problems that he had experienced and seen in his lifetime and really wanted to make well. So that was one Lyndon Johnson. I think another Lyndon Johnson is the one that understands and has real empathy for the people who work for him, and really understood that the demands he was making on them, and in his way tried to make up for those demands, and had very kind ways of expressing his gratitude for people who helped him. He was a character, and when I met my wife, Olivia Barclay, she was practicing law in Washington, and met and was taken by her. A month later, actually proposed, and this was in June of 1968. In August of '68, she was about ready to give her answer that she would marry me. It took her a while. In any event, she was going to show that not only was she a very good lawyer, but she could also cook. So she was planning to have a dinner that she had taken time off from the law firm, spent several hours cooking at her apartment in Georgetown in Washington. And I forget, it was like a Tuesday night or a Thursday night. And in those days, since the president wasn't running for re-election, we were able to leave the White House usually by 9 o'clock. So we had scheduled this dinner at 9 o'clock that night. That afternoon, Ambassador Dobrynin of the Soviet Union called me and asked to see the president if he could see him right at 6 o'clock that night. Well, we scheduled that meeting with Ambassador Dobrynin, not knowing for sure what the meeting was about. We were planning a trip to Moscow. We had several things that we were working with the Russians, as you know, trying to get a peaceful solution to the Vietnam conflict. At 6 o'clock, Ambassador Dobrynin comes into the cabinet room and informs the president that at that moment Soviet troops, Russian troops, were crossing the Czechoslovakian border to put down the rebellion in Czechoslovakia. Well, obviously we brought everybody back to the White House. We were down in the Situation Room and assessing the situation. About 2 o'clock the next morning, I realized I was supposed to have dinner with Olivia Barclay, my hope-to-be wife, and so I called her and explained, and she understood. Well, she had taken this dish that she spent several hours cooking and just put it in the refrigerator. Well, the next couple of nights, I was actually living up on the third floor at the White House, and so she was going to resurrect this dinner about 5 nights later. And again, we scheduled it at 9 o'clock at her apartment. And virtually at 9 o'clock, the president called me into his office, and we were going over the next day's activities. He said, Bird's out of town. He said, why don't you come over to the mansion and have dinner with me? I said, well, Mr. President, I'm sorry, but I've already scheduled a dinner with my girlfriend, Olivia Barclay, and she's made this dinner at her apartment. He said, fine, I'll come too. So I said, okay, and I went back in my office, called Olivia and said, you think you can get another serving out of that dish? And she said, I think I can. Who's coming? I said, well, the President of the United States. Well, she didn't believe me. And several minutes later, in unmarked cars, we had wended our way through Georgetown and parked in her garage. And 2 Secret Service men had preceded us to look inconspicuous, which was not easy in that apartment building. But in any event, we came to the apartment, and he had a wonderful evening. Olivia had these antique wicker chairs, I recall. And when we sat down to dinner, the bottom fell out of the president's chair. As I've said, to give you some idea of the size of the president's bottom, he never knew it fell out. But it was one of those marvelous evenings where he was relaxed. It was just a wonderful event, and it was just the side of his character a human side, a very human side that most people didn't see when they saw him just on television talking about Vietnam. He was a curious person. One time, one year, he took up different things at different times. Like he would swim every afternoon for a period of time in the White House pool. Or this particular summer, it was every Saturday afternoon we would go out on the Sequoia on the boat and go down the river to Quantico, spend the night with a few guests, and then come back on Sunday afternoon. Well, this particular time we came back on a Sunday afternoon, and this was when the, quote, hippies were in the parks and demonstrating and singing and all the kinds of things of the 60s. Anyway, you want to know what a hippie looked like. And so we get in unmarked cars again, coming off the boat, and he says, let's go to DuPont Circle. So we go around DuPont Circle, and he just drives around and around, and he's looking to see what hippies look like in person as opposed to being on television. And it was so funny because we went around one time, and he was just, he's so curious and just looking out the window. And a car came along to the side, and they looked and did this double take. I said, "No, it couldn't be. Couldn't be Lyndon Johnson in this." But that's the kind of person he was. He also became, I think he always was at one level a religious person, and not by a particular religion, but facing the kinds of things he had to face, there's no question that he recognized a higher authority existed, and that would help guide him. When Lucy became a Catholic, he became interested in some of the priests, and particularly over in southwest Washington. There was a place called St. Dominic's, which is run by the Dominican fathers, and he called them the little monks. And he used to go over, and they would have a little private prayer service for him in the back of the large church in their chapel. And we would come back from time to time, and he'd say, "Let's go over to the little monks." And so I would call the priests and said, "Can you? Would this be convenient?" And they'd always say yes. And again, one time we were coming back from one of the boat trips, and Arthur Krim and Matilda were guests, and he said, "Let's go over to the little monks." So I called over and arranged this, and we all went over in the back of the chapel there, and they had this prayer service, and they had gone through this and a little bit of singing and some more prayers, and he stayed at the front, knelt down, and finally one of the priests came over to me and said, "You think that's enough? This is all we prepared for." And I said, "I think that'll be enough." So, but he was wonderfully curious person. So many stories about him. One of the things I like about the LBJ reunions is everybody's got a story, and each one tops the other. And generally speaking, they're all new and not that repeated, just because there were so many instances that in which he affected you. I think another story would be the whole process of his deciding not to run for re-election. The first I really came across that was in September 1967, when he had a weekend trip to the ranch, and he had invited only John Connally. And so it was John Connally, who was then governor of Texas, Lady Bird Johnson, Marie Famer, and myself. And most of the weekend, Governor Connally and Lady Bird and the president rode around the ranch and talked about this, but this was the topic as to whether or not he should run for re-election. If you'll recall, at that time was sort of the transition when Marvin Watson was moving over to be basically the director of the campaign and to get the campaign for 1968 going, and I was sort of de facto replacing Marvin in the appointment secretary's job at the White House and doing the government stuff, and Marvin was doing the political stuff. the weekend went back and forth as to whether or not he should, and he asked our opinions as to whether he should or he should not. But really, he was interested in Lady Bird and John Connolly's opinions. And Governor Connolly had said that he wasn't going to run. He thought that President Johnson should not run either. And anyway, the weekend was over. Nothing else was said about it, and I was still. I guess I was still of the opinion that President Johnson could not voluntarily give up this kind of power, the presidency. And so I didn't think anything more about it. And then along comes December 1967, and I was sort of coordinating, pulling together the various writers for the State of the Union and the cabinet people who were feeding information for the State of the Union speech in January 1968. And he asked me to have Horace Busby do a peroration that he was to that speech that only Buzz should know about, and that he was not going to seek re-election. So Buzz worked on that, and we had it on a separate piece of paper on none of the speech texts. And we worked on that at the ranch in December and came back in January. And so I didn't know if he would or would not use that in the State of the Union. And ultimately, he did not use that in the State of the Union speech, and he had several excuses for it, that he had forgotten it on his on the night table in the bedroom, and he didn't have the piece of paper with him, and things like that. I think as a practical matter, he really wanted to get his legislative program through, and he was concerned that being a lame duck, once you announce you're not running for re-election, being a lame duck would prevent him from getting his program through. And so he didn't announce it. Well, I again assumed that he just wasn't going to voluntarily give up the presidency. So then we come to March 1968, and he has a little press conference in the Rose Garden, and to announce that he's going to have a major speech on Sunday night, March 31, and on Vietnam. And so anyway, after he meets with the reporters in the Rose Garden, goes back to the Oval Office, and he calls for Marvin Watson, George Christian, and myself to come in. That was about 6 o'clock, I guess, that night, on Friday night, the 29th. And he said he's thinking about announcing he's not going to run. What did we think? Well, we spent, I don't know, 2 or 3 hours talking about this. George Christian had the John Connolly view that he should not run. Marvin and I obviously had a different political view, that he should run, and that if he didn't run, he was basically handing over the party to Bobby Kennedy, who had been his arch rival, etc. And they had not been on good terms as opposed to his relationship with the other Kennedys. So we argued it back and forth as to what he could and should not do. And he listened and then told me to later to have Buzz work on the peroration again about not running. So we got a hold of Buzz, and he went up to the Indian Treaty Room up on the third floor and worked on this over the weekend. And that particular speech, for the March 31st speech, went through several iterations. I don't remember how many new drafts, but there were many. And only very, very few people knew that Buzz was working on the "I will not run" speech. We talked about whether he should or he shouldn't, and he gave many reasons why he shouldn't. He talked about the fact that his father and grandfather before him had died at age 64, and he expected to die at age 64, which means he would not have fulfilled his term as president if he were reelected. He talked about the fact that he was always on the go, and he never really knew his daughters, and that he finally had a grandson, a first grandchild, and he was just doted over that little boy, and that he wanted to know his grandchildren, and he couldn't do that if he was going to be president. He had a lot of reasons like that, but the real reason, I think, was the one on Vietnam. And he talked about how if he were to be a candidate for president, there would be the temptation to to make a political decision as opposed to a good overall decision on how to get peace in Vietnam. And he even said that what if we had an opportunity to conclude the Vietnam War within a month or two of the election. If I were a candidate, I would be very tempted to postpone that decision, because if I did something and tried to take advantage of possibly getting a peaceful agreement, it might be misinterpreted and have a political backfire effect to it, and I might be tempted to postpone trying to get a full agreement or doing what would be right to conclude that war. And I don't want to do that. He really felt that he could conclude the Vietnam War before he left office that year. And I think that was the real reason, because Vietnam had aged him far beyond his years. It was the kind of thing that he took personally, seeing these young men that he was sending into war, sometimes just before they went off. And then looking at the results of bombing raids and how many pilots were lost and who was lost, having a son-in-law over there, and having to live with a rumor that Chuck Robb, had been killed in action, and only to find it was not accurate. But all of those things really weighed on him in a personal way, and he wanted to conclude that war. And I think that was the real reason why he didn't run. We had asked Ollie Quayle, who was a pollster, to do some polls before he made this decision as to whether or not it would look like he was, in his own mind, being run out of office. And all of the polls, against all the candidates rather, showed that Lyndon Johnson would beat all the candidates, from Bobby Kennedy to Richard Nixon to Nelson Rockefeller, etc. So I think that was the real reason. Anyway, he made the decision. After the speech was over, it was really like a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He just it was like he had a new buoyancy. It was not that he was down or it was a doubtful decision. It was like now let's get on with this concluding this war. These were some of the things I don't know if
very good.
You want me to see
seamless.
Want me to see if I just jotted down some things.
Sure.
Let's see if there's anything else.
How about his relationship with Lady Bird?
Yeah, let me mention that here.
Yeah, I'm going to change types while
Okay.
I have this break.
How much more do you want me to do on this?
Whatever,
I'd written down a few things here that.
get what you want at the end.
Okay.
There's no hurry.
Okay. All right. You tell me.
You want some water?
Yeah. Let me.
You're
Yeah.
Okay.
I might just add a couple of things on a personal note. I mentioned about how President Johnson really just made you feel like $1 million with your family. My parents from Muskogee, Oklahoma, were visiting one time, and they came to a signing ceremony in the cabinet room. And President Johnson singled them out and brought them over and really made them as proud parents, I guess, to say what I was doing at the White House, etc. And I didn't really recognize that at that age, but now I do, having children of our own. But my parents went back to Muskogee, Oklahoma, to show you a father's perspective. I would get to the White House about 7 to 7:30 at the latest in the morning to go to the president's bedroom and go over the daily activities, and I never left until about 11, sometimes midnight at night when the president went to bed. And this occurred the whole time my parents were visiting me. So my dad goes back to Muskogee and tells all about the trip and tells about how President Johnson sort of featured them at this signing ceremony in the cabinet room, and talked about his son. He said, you know, my son really works hard. He said he goes to the White House every morning about 6:30, 7 o'clock, and he stays there till 11 o'clock, midnight. He said, you know what? The president stays with him the whole time. That's a parent's perspective, which now I understand that I didn't at the time. I was embarrassed by. Bob, you had asked me about the relationship with Lady Bird. It was a very interesting relationship. Lyndon Johnson, I think, relied on Lady Bird's judgment more than anybody else. Her instinctive judgment about people, about things in general. And I know when we would give a major speech, or if we were going to the Manila conference on Vietnam, or various things like that, the final person that he wanted to bounce off an idea or to bounce off the speech would be Lady Bird. And she was an amazing woman, is an amazing woman, in that she just had an instinctive understanding about how to phrase something, how to connect with people, how to assess people, and he really trusted that judgment. And it was a love affair. It was a complicated love affair, but it was a love affair and a partnership that really worked. Other things, there were so many, I'm telling funny stories, or at least to me were funny, stories about Lyndon Johnson, because I think this was the side of a Lyndon Johnson that the public didn't know, that only these tapes being released are giving some idea of what Lyndon Johnson was like, or the many Lyndon Johnsons were like. He was very spontaneous. In 1967, I think it was, we had a Central American summit in El Salvador, and we stayed at our ambassador's residence in San Salvador. And our ambassador was a fellow named Raul Castro from Arizona, and President Johnson had named him as ambassador to El Salvador and was reappointing him as ambassador to Bolivia. And so we stayed there, and among the people we found there was a Chinese houseboy whose family was still in the PRC. And so somewhere in these conversations, Ambassador Castro said that this Chinese houseboy was really terrific, and that somehow President Johnson ought to take him back to the United States and because he was not going to go to Bolivia with Ambassador Castro. Well, I didn't know about this conversation, and so the first morning of the summit, the president of El Salvador calls on the ambassador's residence, and the two presidents in the back seats and me in the jump seat, and go down to the convention. And so the president of El Salvador had some kind of a foreign aid grant request for a few $1 million to build something in El Salvador. So he wanted to take advantage of that time to kind of lobby President Johnson to get that request granted. So as every time he get to the 10 million or however much it was, a point President Johnson interrupted him and would tell me, Jim, we got the Chinaman. Going to take him back with us on the plane? Well, I had no idea what he was talking about, and I said, of course, Mr. President, we'll take care of that. Everything's going to be fine. Well, the conversation would go back to this aid grant and get to that $10 million request, and again he'd say, now be sure the Chinaman's on the plane with us. I said, yes, Mr. President, we'll have him there. Well, I didn't think anything more about it. The conference, the summit goes forward, and at the end of the summit, President Johnson says magnanimously to all the presidents of Central America, he says, why don't you fellows ride back with me on Air Force One and we'll drop you off at each of your countries. Well, they all accepted. Well, this was totally unplanned, and so we had to scramble to get Secret Service people and advance people to all of these other 5 countries and plan a little ceremony at each of these countries. So that was done in very short order. We go, after all the closing and everything, we go back to the residence and then to the Air Force One. And all the presidents are there in the back in the President Johnson's quarters on Air Force One, and I come in and he leans over to me and he said, where's my Chinaman? I said, Mr. President, I'm not sure, I don't know what you're talking, and he erupts and he says, oh, I said, oh, that Chinaman. And these were days when that was not politically, more political correctness in terms were not, I'm quoting now. I said, oh, that one. I said, yes, as a matter of fact, we're going to have him on a next plane to Washington. Well, I go up to the front of the plane, get on the phone and say, well, you've got to get a plane down here and pick up this fellow and take him back to Washington. So we drop off each of the presidents at their respective countries, and our advanced people had a little ceremony in one of those countries because President Johnson liked artwork from places he visited. They decided to have their National Art Gallery take their prized artwork and display it at the airport reception inside the terminal. So we're going around with the president of that country, and President Johnson's admiring the artwork, and he stops at one. He says, "I'll take this one." Well, the jaw of that host country president nearly dropped, but that artwork is now at the LBJ Library. It was like the Mona Lisa of that particular country. Anyway, we get back to Washington and go to the bedroom the next morning, and he says, "Where's my Chinaman?" I said, "It's coming, probably be here tomorrow." You know, well, he picks him up. He's brought back. This Wong at that time spoke Spanish and Chinese and no English. He is taken from El Salvador to Washington, taken up to the guest quarters of the White House. That's his first time in the United States, and he's brought. And I'm told the next day that he's here. So I go to the bedroom, and the president says, and we're going over stuff. And I said, "Well, Mr. Wong is here." He says, "Great, have him brought in." And so this little fellow who weighed 100 pounds at most is brought in, and he has 2 interpreters. One speaks Spanish, one translates in Spanish, one in Chinese. And so President Johnson would ask him various questions, and he would answer, and one interpreter would start with the translation, and the second one would finish. And finally, you see President Johnson, he said, "Now, why you fellows, why doesn't one of you do it?" And he said, "Well, he starts in Spanish and he finishes in Chinese." And as President Johnson, he said, "Tell him when you start in Spanish, you finish in Spanish. When you start in Chinese, you finish in Chinese." In any event, Mr. Wong became on the personal staff of President Johnson and stayed with him right until his death. And the good news is, as I understand it, Mr. Wong's entire family was reunited, and they're living in the United States, and it was just a great experience. Let's see, what other things that might be of interest. There are so many that unless someone prompts something, President Johnson's a practical joker, which a lot of people didn't know. One of the things he liked to do as both a practical joke and to move people forward. In the 60s, it was a time of change in a certain amount of social turmoil, as you know. And President Johnson wanted to bring, particularly had such a devotion to civil rights and to bringing about an equality among races. Well, he would show movies in the hangar at the ranch, and he would invite people from townspeople or friends of his who are Texans to come down, and he liked to see their reactions. He pretended to go to sleep during the movies, but he would be secretly watching everybody else's reactions. And a couple of those, one was The Graduate, where it was racy for those days. And the other one was Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which was an interracial marriage situation. It was Sidney Poitier and Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, and it was one of those cutting-edge movies about understanding race and what have you. And he really delighted in both bringing those movies and inviting people and seeing how they reacted in their attitudes. Fascinating person in every respect. I don't think I'll ever meet or know someone who is multifaceted, who had a razor-sharp mind, a memory that wouldn't quit. Again, going back to a White House experience, we had to send up legislation to do something on the strategic reserve. These are the special metals, special minerals that we had in a strategic stockpile. And we wanted to have some legislative changes to that. And Joe Califano had been assigned that responsibility. And Joe was having a difficult time trying to figure out on a couple of these rare metals or rare items that had been in the stockpile, who knew what they were for, et cetera. And he raised the issue, and President Johnson said, well, you know, back about 30 years ago when I was a young congressman on the Naval Committee, there was a fellow on the staff who was an expert in these things, and the last I heard, I think he was living up in Maine or Vermont. He said, have the White House operators see if they can find him. Well, Joe did. They found him, and Joe said it was remarkable. He was surprised that Lyndon Johnson remembered him. He was the expert on those particular issues, and it said it solved the problem. So he had a memory like that. He also had an intuition and an instinct about Congress, even though he had not been in the Congress for, at that time, roughly 8 years. He had an intuitive understanding of the web, of the flow of congressional activity. One of them had to do with the appointment or the nomination of Abe Fortas as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and Homer Thornberry to take the vacancy of the Supreme Court. This was following Chief Justice Earl Warren's resignation. And President Johnson assigned, Cliff Alexander, myself, Barefoot Sanders, Joe Califano, his top team at the White House to make sure this got through the Congress. And a Republican senator from Michigan, Bob Griffin, was leading the opposition to that. And here we had the best talent, and we really thought we knew what we were doing, trying to garner votes and get an accurate vote count, whip count. And I remember we would meet periodically with the president, and he would want a progress report, and he was pushing us and really prodding us to do these things. Well, we had one meeting, and we were giving him the report, and we were still optimistic that we might win the vote. And he said, fellows, you lost it. He said, the tide's turned. The vote's over. And at that time, we hadn't recognized it. And we had been in contact and sometimes on the Hill itself. And President Johnson, not having been there, understood the flow of congressional activity and when tides turn, et cetera, and he still had that sense, that intuitive sense about the way Congress works and whether or not you could succeed there.
It's a good story.
God, there's so many others, I can't
Yeah.
think of them all.
Well, it's great. It's be a great resource for
Okay.
the library.
Good. Okay, thank you. Great to see you.